I'm going to try to talk a little bit about where do we stand in education and some of the issues that are going to affect this next session. I also want to hopefully leave a little time for question and answers before we finish. The question of where we stand in education is one that I've been involved with for a long time. Actually, I got here about 44 years ago. Took my first job with the Governor's Committee on Public School Education, which was a committee that John Connolly appointed and was chaired by later Watergate prosecutor Leon Jaworski. Now, I was very lowly. I don't mean to say that I was, so some of the ideas of that committee, but that committee probably was the best one I ever worked for in many ways. And people have asked some days why I've stayed in this, and I said, well, I don't think I ever finished the first job I took. That Senate Bill 4, 1965 created that committee, and it said that the committee would present the legislature with a definite long-range plan that would enable Texas to emerge as a national leader in education aspiration, commitment, and achievement. And that was, as I'll report today, we haven't made it yet. But we're still trying. Now, in the process, we have made a lot of progress over time, but one of the things with that committee that turned out to be instrumental in my life was that the director of the committee handed me the education code of the day. It was an assembly of the laws of Texas on education. And he said, find out if there are any goals for public education in this document. And so I read the document. I read it from front page to back page, and about 1,000 pages of education law. I couldn't find a goal. But I did find a lot about education. I became the only person that anybody knew who had ever read all of the laws of Texas. And I tell you, it makes you a very valuable staff member if you've read all of the laws of Texas and had some understanding of them. So one of the parts that I missed in reading that, because I just thought, well, this is interesting language. It doesn't really mean very much, but it was the language from the state constitution. And the state constitution, adopted in 1876, begins in public education to say that a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservations of the liberties and rights of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. And those words have turned out to be the cornerstone of what much of the litigation on school finance has been about over the past 20 years. In fact, if you go back and read your history of education, you'll find that even in the 1800s, there was a tremendous debate, as there is today, over what is the general diffusion of knowledge. What is it we're trying to teach our children? What is it we expect from our education system? That in terms of the legislature making suitable provision hasn't really been argued yet, but in terms of an efficient system, it turned out the legislature had created an inefficient system, which led in the Edgewood litigation to the school finance system being declared unconstitutional. Public free schools, we still have a debate about as to whether we actually have public free schools effectively in many of our systems when you consider the amount of money that is put in through foundations and other elements. And then the last part, which wasn't in the education section, but it said that we couldn't have a statewide property tax. We actually used to have a statewide property tax a long time ago in Texas, but we banned it somewhere in the 1970s in that big pink building you're going to visit today. Now I got to work in that building for a number of years. I still do, but I visit now. But for a while I was the Lieutenant Governor's Director of Research, Bill Hobby's Director of Research. I assure you that what you're going to see over there today is a whole lot nicer than what we used to be in. There was some rumor that the basement of the Capitol had one time been the stables, and most of us who worked down in there thought that was probably a fairly accurate description. It's a lot nicer now. When they discovered back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, close to 30 now, that the Capitol couldn't hold all of the people who were in it. And that's why they built the extension, because they were afraid the thing was going to fall down if they didn't get around to taking care of it. Now, I started off talking about aspiration and commitment. And our legislature, when you talk to your legislators, sometimes they're not aware of just how, of the laws that have been passed by prior legislatures and the commitments that they've made in statute. And I think if they would just fulfill their own commitments, we would be a great deal better off in public education. For instance, there is a section on mission and objectives of the education system in state law, and we'll furnish you with copies of those. But it talks about such things as students being encouraged and challenged to meet their full educational potential, through enhanced dropout prevention efforts, to provide that all students will remain in school until they obtain a high school diploma. Remember that one, by the way. I'm going to come back and talk about some numbers in a little while, but this is one of the major challenges that I think education faces today, and that you may wish to urge upon legislators and staff when you visit them. They talk about a well-balanced and appropriate curriculum, that qualified and effective personnel will be available, that students will demonstrate exemplary performance in national and international standards, that there'll be a safe and disciplined environment, and that technology will be well used, and that students, the goals of public education, that students demonstrate exemplary performance in English language, mathematics, science, and social studies. So 44 years later from that statement about becoming a national leader in educational aspiration, commitment, and achievement, actually we're doing pretty well on the aspiration side. We'll get to the commitment and the achievement in a little bit. Also within the funding system of the state, which is what I spend most of my time on today, and by the way, my role in all this, we have a firm, Moak, Casey and Associates, which works with school districts throughout the state. We are registered as lobbyists for public education, but as well do a good deal of school finance research in the process, and have also participated in all of the major litigation efforts in public education finance. But the provisions of the Foundation School Program become even more precise. In section 42001, it talks about programs and services that are appropriate to the student's educational needs and that are substantially equal to those available to any similar student, notwithstanding varying local economic factors. And it commits the legislature to develop a public school finance system that adheres to a standard of neutrality for substantially equal access to similar revenue per student at similar tax effort, considering all state and local tax revenues. So when you talk to your legislature, remind them of those commitments, because I find in legislatures turn over, as you know, from time to time, and I find that sometimes that they have forgotten what their predecessors have passed and what is the law of the state of Texas in terms of the policy.